Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. I'm wearing all blue because it's Spirit Week, and I've got spirit. Yes, I do. I've got spirit. How about We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to explain the circumstances that caused the First World War. You should be able to describe the tactics and weapons used in the Great War. You should be able to characterize America's initial resistance and eventual entry into World War I. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 11. And we might say that the causes of the Great War, the World War I, the World War, they were all interchangeable terms for it, but the causes of the Great War were both like long-term causes as well as instant causes in that moment. And generally, historians identify four more or less contributors in the long-term factors of what caused World War I. And here we might identify first as nationalism. Nationalism is the idea of like a devotion to the interests or culture of one nation. It's actually, to take nationalism, it's a little bit beyond patriotic. It's almost when it becomes disordered and people begin to think of like in a disordered understanding of their country. In nationalism in the beginning part of the 20th century led to a lot of competition and jealousy between nations. Take, for instance, the country of Germany. Germany was a recently united country, and it was an emerging industrial power, and that a lot of people really feared Germany's growth in Europe and its encroaching power along Europe. But there's also, besides Germany, there's various ethnic groups which were resented being dominated by outside of others, and they wanted independence. If you looked at the map of Europe at the time, and in particular Europe, it happens in other places, but we're in Europe here in this moment. There's a lot of countries that the boundaries don't necessarily match the people that are in it. And so minorities are ruled over by majorities with greater power, or the other way around, even majorities are ruled over by minorities with greater power. Anyway, that like disbalance of ethnic groups within countries feeling like they were resented power of the outsiders and wanting independence to do so. And maybe a great example of this is Russia. Russia saw itself as like the big brother to protect all of the smaller Slavic peoples, which were kind of the peoples of Eastern Europe. All like Russia saw themselves as the protector of all of those, even if they were, Slavic peoples in some other rival country. And all of this stuff gets kind of wrapped up into a nationalist idea. Subpoint B. We also might look at imperialism. And again, let's return to Germany on this one. Germany, as a recently united and growing power country, was also turning into an industrial powerhouse. That growing industry pushed Germany and their rivals to take new overseas territories to go support that new industrializing growth. Countries were hoping to expand their empires by supporting their resources and trade along the way. And imperialism was fueled by nationalism. The idea that like our country is the best gets wrapped up in this imperial idea as each country tried to compete with others and outscore their rivals. Then that leads us kind of naturally to a subpoint C of what to do about militarism, because militarism is this idea of developing armed forces and then using those new armed forces as a tool of diplomacy. And so as you get rivals with other countries, not only are you rivaling them for economic reasons or for imperial reasons, you're also got like the military power to go escalate the situation. The developing modern armed forces, but also, the cost of building and defending empires led to like increased military spending along the way, and then increased military spending along the way puts greater demands on the economy, which puts greater demands on the industrialization, all of which is fueled by nationalism. And then take again Germany. By 1890, Germany had the strongest army on the whole continent of Europe, and their competition in Britain with sea power led others to join in a naval arms race, and it's all tied in with what's going on in the United States with Alfred T. Mahan and the sea power upon history, and all of these things accelerate the situation even more. But it's kept in an uneasy peace because of an alliance system. As countries try to build up alliances and develop along the way, where alliances could give a country a certain amount of security. And nations became unwilling to tip that balance of power. Because if you're going to go and try to, assert power over some particular country, then that's going to trigger an alliance system, but they're going to drag all those new people into the war. And, those nations become unwilling to tip the balance of power. In general, we might say that the countries sorted themselves into essentially two significant groups. On one side, you have the Triple Entente. This group is also known as the Allies, which is kind of a tricky name because allies, there's all alliances. And the other side would also call themselves allies. So my favorite term is for the Entente. And it's a French term, which basically means allies. But anyway, it's Great Britain, France, and Russia, which you might call, recognized by its acronym, Great Big Fat Rat. Great Britain, France, and Russia is the way I kind of remember who's on the Triple Entente. There's also the Central Powers. Now, the Central Powers is also called the Triple Alliance, which is tricky because you've got the Triple Alliance, but the Entente is also sometimes called the Allies. And the Central Powers, I think, is a more helpful, useful term here. And that's Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. To a lesser extent, the Ottoman Empire. And the way that I kind of remember that is that Grandma always hated idiots and the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, Italy would switch sides, and that because, the idiots will switch into the deal. But both sides started out as like these trade and diplomatic agreements that would develop into later security agreements along the way. Now, those are the long-term causes of the Great War, of World War I, but there was also short-term causes, and these are significant as well. The short-term cause was actually kind of a minor event. It was not a significant moment in history, except for what it led to, and it was actually a minor event, but it was the spark that ignited the powder keg of European tensions. And it was an assassination which led to war, and the alliances complicated the conflict along the way. The Balkan Peninsula of Europe was often known as the powder keg of Europe. When I say powder, I want you to think of like gunpowder, right? It was the powder keg of Europe. It was a potentially explosive and dangerous place because of the ethnic rivalries among the people of the Balkan Peninsula, and then the leading powers of Europe all had economic and imperial and political interests there as well. And in a really kind of a minor case, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, he wasn't even like the guy in charge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was like the next guy in charge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Was shot by a minor Serbian nationalist terrorist gang. And this group, known as the Black Hand, is not a significant group, but they put together an assassination attempt and, against all odds, kill Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In response, they find out this Serbian nationalist terrorist gang, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. They're expecting kind of a short war. Serbia is not a significant power. Austria-Hungary is rich and powerful. But the problem was the alliance system pulls in one country after another. And like Serbia is one of those Slavic peoples. And then so Russia's like, no, you can't go beat up on my little buddy. And then so like Russia comes into the war and declares war on Austria-Hungary. And then Germany's like, but you can't declare war on Austria-Hungary. So Germany comes into the war after that. And then it drags in France and Belgium and United Kingdom, Great Britain is not really the United Kingdom, but anyway, like this tumbling alliance system, which was supposed to keep an uneasy peace, is also the piece that drags everybody into the most significant world conflict. That assassination led to war, and then alliances end up tumbling it all in. Roman numeral number 12. So Germany goes to war, and Germany becomes the main aggressor on this. Even though we might identify Austria-Hungary as like the first real aggressor of this, Germany is really the driving force behind it. And Germany, they have a plan known as the Schlieffen Plan to go fight in the Great War. And the Schlieffen Plan basically says that Germany is in a two-front war. On one side, it's fighting Russia, and on the other side, it's fighting France. And figuring that the Russians are going to be much harder to beat, but just being, in general, the disorganization of Tsarist Russia, they can be held off for a while. But on the other hand, France. Now, France, they felt like, is going to fall sooner because they're French and they're just going to lose the battle faster. But France is going to mobilize more quickly. And so Germany needs to put its effort into attacking and taking France, and then can go put off and fighting Russia along the way. That's known as the Schlieffen Plan. Some historians doubt the veracity of the Schlieffen Plan, basically saying like that was more of a paper idea than an actual battle plan. But anyway, probably the mainstream view on it. Anyway, by August of 1914, German troops swept across Belgium on their way into France, and that caused a major refugee crisis. By spring of 1915, there were these two parallel systems of trenches which were cut into the earth. So basically like digging a hole in the ground, and a really long hole becomes a trench. And then both sides would stand in the hole and try to shoot into the other side. And that's what's known as trench warfare. Germany's Central Powers on one side and France and England's Entente on the other. Between the trenches was known as a no man's land, a barren expanse of mud between the opposing trenches. And the scale of the, trenches are a pretty good defensive position of their day. Like it's an easy way to hold land. It makes it a really hard way to advance land. And so the scale of killing could be horrific and unprecedented, but ultimately inconclusive. Trench warfare in the style of World War I could get a whole bunch of people killed, but never really advance the cause of either side. Subpoint B. Immediately at the outbreak of the war, Great Britain blockaded and mined the North Sea, which stopped any war supplies from reaching Germany. The blockade that was unusually restrictive. It not only stopped war supplies, which is not unusual in a time of war, but it also stopped civilian supplies, things like food and fertilizer along the way, from reaching Germany. And by 1917, really famine had struck Germany, and then Germany felt like Great Britain was trying to starve them into submission and saying, this is not a fair way to fight the war. I mean, you're not even fighting the battle at this point. You're fighting all the civilians and trying to starve them into submission. And that's, there's no really like war regulatory board at the time. But this certainly seemed like it was unfair. And Americans also considered this a violation of the old open door policy, the John Hay policy that came out of the Spanish-American War and the idea of keeping ports open. And Americans said, well, if we can't do business with Germany either, then Great Britain, that's a violation of our open door policy. But before the United States could protest, Germany responded on their own. Subpoint C. In retaliation, Germany set up a counter-blockade of Great Britain with their new U-boats. U-boat is an Unterseeboot. It's a German word which means underwater boat. Basically, it's submarines. Then any British or Allied ship in the waters around Great Britain was sunk without any warning. It was a very aggressive policy. It basically said, like, if you were a British or Allied ship and we didn't even know what's on it, you're a target, you're going to get sunk. In May 7th of 1915, a U-boat sunk the British liner Lusitania. Lusitania was just a liner. It was just a passenger ship. It was not considered like a military ship, and there was 128 Americans on the dead. Now, passenger ships aren't considered fair targets for war, but Germany insisted the passenger ship was also like hauling ammunition, and it probably was. It probably was hauling ammunition. Nevertheless, United States public opinion began to turn against Germany because now Americans are getting killed into the fighting as well. President Wilson protested the submarine war, but Germany continued to sink ships anyway. They called for, so Wilson has this great line. He says, we need peace without victory. Like, please don't make somebody surrender into submission on this. Can we just declare peace and get out? So get a peace without victory, and that's a peace that could last. So Wilson actually rolled out a military response. America is typically isolationist at this time. So rolled out a military response, hoping to negotiate an answer instead. And Wilson really feels like he's the man to go negotiate an answer for this. He was a political science professor. He's one of those guys that has all of the answers sort of figured out. World peace is literally his life's work of study, and he feels like he's the man that can go solve the problem on it. Germany then sank another liner. It was a French ship known as the Sussex, which also killed some Americans. Again, Wilson protested Germany's policy. In negotiation, Germany said, okay, if the United States, if you can get Britain into lifting this blockade, then we'll quit sinking ships, because that's really what it's about. It's about breaking the blockade. Otherwise, if you can't, then we need to go break our blockade, and we're going to continue this unrestricted marine warfare. Subpoint D. Let's go back to the land a little bit here. Along Germany's western front, now the western front, from Germany's point of view, is the French border. Both sides dug trenches for the soldiers to fight from. And the trenches grew into an underground network of bunkers, and some trenches were for fighting and some were for carrying supplies and others for medical treatment along the way. The trenches were unpleasant. Like the classic understanding of World War I is an idea of trench warfare. And it's standing in a hole for years. I mean, this is an awful way to fight a war. Either swamped in cold mud or left out to bake in the sun. The soldiers had to deal with rats and lice, and a lot of them developed trench foot. And there's photos of this, and I'm not going to show them on the. I guess you can look them up if you want to go see what it is. But what happens is that after months of standing in wet, dirty mud, the foot and the leg bones of soldiers just soften into this like infected goo known as trench foot. And it's awful and gross. And then the legs have to be, amputated along the way. And it turns out you could solve trench foot by at night just taking your boots and socks off and letting your feet dry out. But people would be so exhausted climbing back into their bunks they wouldn't. They'd sleep with their boots on, and then that would just circulate the problem, and it's gross. There was also a no man's land between the opposing trenches. It was especially dangerous. If a soldier tried to advance out of their trench, they had to go in this like bombed out area between the two trenches to go try to advance into the other side. They would be totally unprotected and really a sitting duck on that. The result was a 4-year stalemate where neither side was able to go defeat the other, but could get a whole bunch of their own people killed along the way. Subpoint E. There was also some technology that changed there, and I want to focus first on the rapid-fire guns. The Gatling gun had actually been invented before the Civil War, but industrial technology had greatly improved the idea of a machine gun by World War I. And modern machine guns were spraying bullets into enemy targets. There was also the invention of barbed wire. We actually met barbed wire earlier in our last period as a technology of the free range, of the open range, which was about building fences for cows. But it also turns out that barbed wire is pretty effective in the battlefield when people have to go get off their foot. So between the two trenches, you could also tangle it up with barbed wire along the way. So if the opponent's side wanted to come in and try to advance into your trench, they had to get through a barbed wire fence to go do that. But it also means that your side can't advance either because it's the same barbed wire and it's pokey on the other side too. So it successfully tangled up the battle lines, kept the enemy out, and kept each other from advancing. Subpoint F. We also remember World War I as the era of like the introduction of chemistry onto the battlefield and chemical weapons. Now, at first, there was the French tried to use tear gas to go break up German forces. Tear gas, particularly of the era, was not very effective. It was too weak to really break up the German forces. It would be annoying and disturbing, but it really couldn't. It wasn't an effective weapon. The Germans also tried a type of tear gas. The German formulation wasn't as good at a tendency to freeze rather than vaporize, which made it kind of worthless as a gas on them. The Germans also started using chlorine as a gas. Now, chlorine is a poisonous gas. Where they would line up these, thousands of tanks along the way. When the wind was right, they would open up the tanks and the, clouds of green gas going, and it's poisonous gas. It's like, this is a real threat. Would go blowing across the battlefield. Hey, chlorine is a particularly awful way to die. It burns the eyes and throats and knows the victims until it slowly suffocates them. And its first use was wildly effective. The Entente forces absolutely panicked and ran. And in the running, they're like breathing harder and sucking in more chlorine, and it just really ruined the Entente forces. But it was also had weaknesses that were quickly discovered. Chlorine gas falls. So imagine being in a trench, and the chlorine gas comes and it just kind of rolls along, stays near the ground, and it rolls into the trench. Soldiers could just go stand up in the trench and more or less get out of the way of the gas. Now, if there were people like the sick and the wounded would stay in the trench and they became vulnerable, of course, they're not really the targets, but that is true. It could also, chlorine is also water soluble. So a person could just like take a towel and get it wet and cover their face with it. Then they could just, breathe through a wet towel and survive the chlorine gas as well. There was also the problem that if the wind changed, which, it's weather, if the wind changed and blew the chlorine gas back onto the German troops, it could, attack the attackers. However, chlorine gas remained a strong psychological weapon, even beyond its military value. It's like just the sight of the green gas rolling across the battlefield could cause the enemy absolutely to panic. The French developed a more significant gas known as phosgene. Phosgene was a gas that was colorless. It actually smelled like wet hay. And so it smelled like farmyards and barnyards, which was kind of what a lot of the trenches were in anyway. And so it basically went unnoticed until its damage were done. Phosgene wasn't as well known as the other gases, but it killed 85,000 people, far more than any of the others. But the most famous of the war was that of mustard gas, and it was a German invention. Mustard gas was the most famous piece of chemical warfare. Introduced in 1917, mustard gas was actually shot out of an artillery shell. Like they would have a big bullet, but instead of being filled with, whatever the lead or the explosive, that was just filled with the phosgene gas or the mustard gas. It was shot out of a cannon, and when it landed, it would explode and spread its gas everywhere. And it was sort of an oily gas, and it would soak into the soil and then emit its vapors for days afterwards. And it was awful. Mustard gas was particularly awful. Its victims were covered in yellow blisters, and it burned the eyes until a person just gets blinded from mustard gas, and then itchy throats would swell shut, and its victim would choke to death. Internal, external bleeding common out of mustard gas. Soldiers were trapped in their trenches. They were particularly vulnerable at it. It terrorized the enemy, but it also, made it impossible to advance. The Germans would go into the area with the mustard gas also, and it's not like they're immune from it there. They would suffer the same problem. Subpoint G. The British had been using tanks since the 1916 Battle of the Somme, but they weren't very effective. The original tanks were more like farm tractors with plating on the side, and it wasn't necessarily bulletproof at the beginning, and the technology was an emerging technology. But by 1970, the British were learning to use tanks to go tear down barbed wire and go clear a path through no man's land. Early planes also developed in this area. Airplane technology is an emerging technology, and they're very imperfect machines. They were originally just real flimsy and only able to use for scouting. They would just fly over and see what the other enemy sides look like. Pilots began to shoot at each other. The pilots would just bring up a gun and try to shoot the other one out of the air. And then airplanes began individual air combat. They're known as dogfights. First with handguns, and then later with mounted machine guns put on the front of the plane. Later, airplanes were stronger and faster and eventually ran these heavy bomb loads along the way. By 1918, the British flew 22,000 bombers and some major pieces. Observation balloons were used extensively. So again, put up a hot air balloon and go fly over the enemy sides, and then you could kind of observe what their tactics were going to look like. They become kind of easy targets for snipers and for air flights along the way. The Untersee boot, the underwater boat, The submarines invented by Germany were mostly used for breaking up blockades and for stopping Entente forces from receiving supplies. They also filled the sailors of the Allied forces with absolute terror. By 1970, Germany's U-boats were so successful at naval combat, they had sunk twice as much ship tonnage as the Allies had built, so they were like sinking them faster than they could be replaced. Subpoint H. The new weapons and new tactics led to horrific injuries and hazards. Troops fought amidst filth and pests and polluted water and poison gas and dead bodies. They were sleep deprived, and the constant bombardment and stress and fatigue produced what's known as shell shock. Shell shock is where like the soldiers' nervous systems were absolutely shattered by the stress and noise of battle. Today, we don't refer to it as shell shock. I mean, the condition still exists, but has a more scientific name of post-traumatic stress disorder. Physical problems experienced by the soldiers include dysentery, which is like infectious diarrhea. It's gross. Trench foot, the infected rotted feet. And then trench mouth, which is infected gums and throat along the way. And World War I was a gross, tough, bad war. I mean, there's no sugarcoating on it. A lot of people got into it thinking it was going to be some romantic battle, and it wasn't. Roman numeral number 13. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson's running for re-election. And he runs for re-election against Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Wilson was campaigning on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Really proud that he was trying to negotiate America's position rather than just like rattling sabers and running into the war. Charles Evans Hughes, on the other hand, said, we're going to go to war, and either the United States is going to be ready for it or we're not. And if Wilson's promising to keep us out of the war, then he's fooling you. Charles Evans Hughes says, basically, we're going to war. Let's go be ready for it. It was a close election, and Hughes actually went to bed thinking that he had won. When a reporter tried to reach him and tell him of the loss, one of Hughes's aides answers the phone and says, "I'm sorry, the president cannot be disturbed." And the reporter replies, "Well, when Hughes wakes up, tell him he's no longer the president." Wilson won re-election by 28 electoral votes, fewer than 600,000 of the 18 million popular votes cast. He did carry 10 out of the 12 states that allowed women's suffrage, mostly on the promise that he would keep the United States out of the war. Historically, in American politics, women are less likely to be excited about going to war. They are stronger pacifists than men are. And so if Wilson's promising to keep out of the war and 10 out of the 12 states extend their vote to women, he's pretty much going to carry the women's vote on that. Subpoint B. The socialists, America's looking at World War I. What's the American position on it? And the truth is that America has a divided position. There's no consistent American position of Americans at the time. Socialists. Socialism was not a huge political movement, but it was not an insignificant one as well. And socialists consider the war, basically the Great War was a struggle between the capitalists on one side, the imperialists on the others, and Germany and England, and they're all trying to control markets and colonies, and the socialists said, to hell with all of it, none of it's any good. While pacifists like William Jennings Bryan was a famous pacifist, and absolutely saying the United States should not be involved in any conflict that's avoidable. Potentially, the United States could go defend its own interests, but absolutely not get into somebody else's interest. William Jennings Bryan believed that all war was evil, and the United States should set an example of peace in the world. And William Jennings Bryan is not unimportant at the time. I mean, he's lost the race for president several times in a row, but he's still the Secretary of State in the Wilson administration, which means that he's the one in charge of dealing with other countries, and he's got a strong pacifist vote on this. Ordinary people were against the United States entering the war anyway, because it's just that's not our problem. America had a strong isolationist streak. Naturalized citizens. So America is a country of immigrants. And we've seen in this era immigration really rapidly coming in. So naturalized citizens, which are naturalized people people who aren't natural citizens, born here of American parents or whatever, but came in and became American. Naturalized citizens became very concerned about the effect on their country of birth. For example, Americans of German descent tended to side with the Germany in the struggle. French descendants tend to sympathize with the Entente side. A lot of Irish Americans look at this and they said, the Irish Americans at the time were really sick of being occupied by the British. And so they said, well, basically, this is actually Great Britain's independence movement and Ireland's independence movement from Great Britain. And it was Britain's distracted elsewhere. A lot of native-born Americans felt like a bond with Great Britain, feeling that those are our people over there in ancestry and language, democracy, and legal system. Woodrow Wilson insisted that the United States, no matter what, isn't going to get into a war unless it promoted democracy. You got to remember that Wilson's position is that moral diplomacy, believing that the United States should be a force of good in the world, and in particular support the advancement of democracy in the world. And Wilson's looking at this and saying, I can't enter on the side of the Entente because that includes Russia. And Russia is ruled over by Tsar Nicholas II. And he's an absolute dictator. And he might be a nice guy, but America would not support an absolute dictatorship. Like an absolute monarchy is just, we're not going to come in on that side. A very undemocratic monarch, and Wilson refused to ally with a dictator. American commerce and shipping, though, were soon dragged into the conflict. The United States had stronger economic ties, the Entente, the Allies. Then with the Central Powers on the other side, the United States was shipping millions of dollars in supplies to the Allies, and requests were still coming along the way. By 1917, the United States had mobilized for war against the Central Powers to ensure the Allied repayment of debts and to prevent Germany's threat to the United States shipping. So point C. In 1917, Wilson tries to mediate the conflict. He tries to call for a peace between equals. And in 1917, Wilson has been reelected, and he wants to keep his pledge of keeping America out of war. Nevertheless, Kaiser Wilhelm, who's leading Germany, announced that U-boats were going to resume sinking all ships in British waters, and if there's American on it, or if they're American ships and they're in British waters, we're at war and they're going to get sunk. It almost certainly meant the United States boats would be sunk and the United States would enter the war. But Wilson said that he was going to wait for actual overt acts. He wasn't just going to go jump into a war unless America was compelled into it. And then in January of 1917, it looks like Germany makes actual overt acts, where a telegram from the German foreign minister in Mexico was intercepted by British agents. It's known as the Zimmermann Note, and he proposed that Germany and Mexico team up, make an alliance, that if Mexico would attack the United States, and if successful, Germany would go help Mexico go reclaim lands which had been part of Mexico, Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. Now, to us moderns today, this seems like really like Texas and Mexico and New Mexico and Arizona, like Germany's going to fight with Mexico to take back these American lands. Like that's not a thing. But you got to put yourself in the time that those lands have not been American for long. Mexico still feels the ties to it, and the United States and Mexico had nearly erupted into war just a couple of episodes before, and this is a real conflict. And Germany then sunk 4 United States merchant ships, and when they did that, it had killed 36 Americans along the way. But the final piece of resistance was when the Russian monarchy was overthrown in the Bolshevik Revolution and replaced the czars with what at least appeared to be a representative democratic government. And that meant the Great War could now be like a side of democracy against autocracy, and Wilson could come in and join on the Entente side of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And even though Russia is about to be communist and a dictatorship, like until it's that, it looks like it's a democratic country, and Wilson could join in without any kind of fear of hypocrisy. Subpoint D. Calling to make the world safe for democracy, Wilson started raising an army. The Selective Service Act of 1917 required men to register for a draft. And then once they would be registered, they could be randomly chosen for military service along the way. By the end of 1918, 24 million men were registered. 3 million of them were actually chosen for service, and 2 million of which actually served in active duty before the end of the war. Around 400,000 African Americans served in segregated units. They were totally excluded from the Navy and the Marines, but some black people were assigned to non-combat duties. There were some exceptions to that. Military training had to be revamped. World War I is a modern scientific war, and it can't be done with the old like slipshod way of the Spanish-American War. This was a scientific war. It needed to be done scientifically. Soldiers trained for 8 months. Training mostly took place in the United States, partially in Europe along the way. They trained for 17-hour days on a variety of tasks, from target shooting to bayonet drills to kitchen duty and cleaning the grounds. Weapons were scarce, so trainees had to go drill with fake weapons until they were proficient. They would handle like rocks that were about the size of a grenade, or poles instead of rifles, but could still be held and handled in a way similar to the way a person would handle a rifle. Harder to shoot though. Women weren't allowed to enlist in the armed forces, but women did serve in the Army and the Navy and the Marines as nurses and secretaries and phone operators. The Army denied women rank and pay and benefits, equal to their men peers. But it was a little different in the Navy and the Marines. There, women got full military rank and benefits along the way. Now, the Navy, while the Navy had grown during the Spanish-American War, it was way outclassed by modern warfare and the standards of the new naval warfare. The United States needed to expand its fleet to transport men and food and equipment to Europe. And so the United States, basically, in an effort to go build boats faster, gave special status to shipyard workers, saying, if you go work in shipyards, then you can be exempted from the draft, and then, or deferring their draft status till later. The United States Chamber of Commerce then joined a public relations campaign to convince the people of the importance of shipyard work. If a person worked in a naval shipyard, they got flags like soldiers and armies received. And not everybody had cars, but you could convince car owners to like, hey, can you go take a shipyard worker to work? When public transit became too crowded to do so. And then when in the shipyards, the new fabrication techniques, building like standardized parts of ships at other places, and then bringing the standardized parts in on railroad cars and just doing the final assembly in the shipyard along the way. That sped up production time significantly. On July 4th of 1918, the United States launched 95 ships in a single day, the biggest launching of Liberty ships, and it promises the future of naval warfare, and it basically seems like how America is going to enter into the Great War, into World War I. The rest of World War I, really the rest of the United States playing in the rest of the world is a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.